Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the whole House will join me in condemning the horrific terrorist attacks in Turkey last night. Our thoughts and prayers are with those who were killed and injured and their families. As yet, there are no reports of any UK casualties, but the Foreign Office are working urgently with the Turkish authorities to establish the full facts. I spoke to President Erdogan this morning to express the UK's condolences and to offer assistance. Details are still emerging, but we stand as one in our defiance against these barbaric acts. Mr. Speaker, this week marks the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, and there will be a national 2-minute silence on Friday morning. I'll be attending a service at the Thiepval Memorial near the battlefield, and it's right that the whole country pauses to remember the sacrifices of all those who fought and lost their lives in that conflict. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Alistair Carmichael.
Very much. And can I first of all associate myself with the Prime Minister's remarks of condolence to all those who've been affected by this dreadful attack in Istanbul. And can I offer him my personal best wishes to himself and his family for life after Downing Street. He has served his country, but he's not done it alone, and I think it's right that we should acknowledge the support that he's had, as we all have, from our families in public service, Mr. Speaker. Before he goes, though, will he attend to one matter that, when he was in opposition, he described as doing enormous moral damage to the moral authority of our country, and that is the involvement of our security services in rendition. Now that the CPS have decided they are not going to prosecute Sir Mark Allen for what he did, will he reconstitute the Gibson inquiry so we can know what was done in our name and on whose authority?
Well, first of all, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his generous remarks. I'm very proud to have served this country and proud to be the first Prime Minister for, I think, 30 years to get to both Shetland and Orkney to make sure I fully looked into his constituency. He raises an important point about the Libya rendition issue. The government cooperated fully with the police investigation into these cases. The CPS set out their position recently, concluding there was insufficient evidence to prosecute. I would say, and I can say these things now, I think there are very few countries in the world that would have had such an independent and thorough investigation into an issue like this. I think the right approach, as Sir Peter Gibson finished the report of what he was able to do, is the ISC has agreed to look at these issues raised in his report, and I think they should continue to do so.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend has said, and perhaps put current events into perspective, at 7:30 this Friday we will start the process of commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. Will my right honourable friend join me in thanking all those involved in organising the Forget Never project in Basildon, who have done so much to ensure that our young people will learn the lessons of the past? And forgetting our current challenges, will he join me in encouraging everyone to remember, salute and commemorate those who made the ultimate sacrifice?
Well, I certainly join my honourable friend in commending all those who are organising these important events, particularly the event he mentions in his constituency, but there will be events up and down the country. And I think it's important, not only because this appalling slaughter, 57,000 people killed or wounded on the first day of this battle, but also because so many people are learning so much about their own families' involvement. And I would say in many ways there is a link between the current events we're discussing and what happened 100 years ago, is the importance of keeping peace and security and stability on our continent. And actually it was noticeable at last night's European Union dinner that the French President actually mentioned the Somme commemorations and how proud he was that we were going to be standing together and remembering those sacrifices all those years ago.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to echo the words of the Prime Minister concerning the 36 who died and the 100 injured in the vile terrorist attack at Ataturk Airport, and I'm sure that our consular services will be doing everything they can to assist those that have been affected. I'd also like to thank him for referring to the memorial for the Somme on Friday, and I look forward to being with him there at the memorial service of those who died in that dreadful battle. I think, Mr. Speaker, it would also be appropriate if we paid tribute to Lord Patrick Mayhew, who died last weekend. As Northern Ireland Secretary, he was the driving force behind the Downing Street Declaration in 1993 that did lead to the first ceasefire. And I think the relative peace we have now in Northern Ireland is in part thanks to him and, of course, his successor, Mo Mowlam, for all that she achieved. Mr. Speaker, what people in the country are worried about is the extra insecurity to their living standards, jobs, wages and pensions following the EU referendum. In recent days, we've heard uncertain words about the future of some of the major companies in Britain, like Siemens, which has been here for a very long time. What meetings has the Chancellor had with major companies, Siemens, Visa, Vodafone and others, to try to stabilise the situation?
Well, first of all, he's absolutely right to mention Patrick Mayhew. He did play a huge role in the delivery of the peace process. He was also a brilliant Attorney General and someone who I think exuded a belief in public service and the national interest and was a kind and goodly man. And I was very sad to hear of his passing. I sent a message to him via his wife shortly before he died, and I know there are many people in this House who want to send their good wishes to his family. The Leader of the Opposition rightly asked what conversations we're having with business and also what preparation we're making to deal with the economic challenges we face. I would say, look, we are in a strong position to meet these challenges because we've paid down so much of our deficit, we've had strong growth and job creation, but I don't belittle at all the consequences will be difficult. There are going to be some very choppy waters ahead. I don't resile from any of the warnings I made during the referendum campaign, but we've got to find the best way through this. Now, one of the things we must do is talk with businesses and reassure them about the stability there is today and the strength of the British economy. The Business Secretary has met with a whole range of businesses already. Tomorrow I have the meeting of my business advisory group, and I'm inviting other companies to that, including Siemens, who play a huge role in the British economy. And what we need to talk about is the reassurances about stability we can give now, the fact that our circumstances don't change until we leave the European Union, and then I want to hear from them as we draw up the possible blueprints for Britain's future position with Europe about what they think would be the right answer.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The credit rating agencies have cut the UK credit rating down to AA from AA+. The Chancellor pledged to keep a AAA rating. What estimate has the government made of the cost to the Exchequer of this downgrade in terms of borrowing costs and of the risks to pension funds?
Well, the Leader of the Opposition is absolutely right that the credit ratings by one agency has been taken down by several points and another has put us on watch. The answer to his question directly is the cost to the Exchequer and to the taxpayer will depend on what happened to the interest rates in the market at which Britain can borrow, and he's absolutely right to draw attention to that. Look, as I said, they're definitely, and the Mario Draghi, the head of the ECB, confirmed this last night. All of the warnings were that if we voted to leave the EU, there would be difficulties in terms of our own economy and growth rates and instability in markets. We're seeing those things. We're well prepared for them in terms of the reaction of the Bank of England and the Treasury. But there's no doubt in my mind these are going to be difficult economic times. What we must do is make sure we maintain our strong economy so we can cope with them. But we shouldn't belittle these challenges. They're going to be difficult and we're going to have to meet them.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everyone across this House should be concerned that the indications from business and investors are they see the UK as less attractive, thus putting current and future jobs at risk. In these circumstances, will the Prime Minister consider suspending the Chancellor's fiscal rule, which is in effect preventing investment from taking place?
I don't believe that would be the right approach. I think, look, what business needs to hear, what consumers and investors and people concerned about our economy want to hear, is that we have taken huge steps over the last 6 years to get the budget deficit down, to make the British economy more competitive, to make it an attractive destination for investment. They want those things to continue. And of course, if we do see economic difficulties, one of the ways we have to react to that is to make sure that our public finances and our economy remain strong. We shouldn't have taken all the steps of the last 6 years to get the deficit down in order to see us get onto a more difficult path. So I don't think it would be right to suspend fiscal rules. As I say, there are three phases to this. The first is the volatility we see, which the Bank of England and the Treasury must cope with. The second is the uncertainty about Britain's future status, which we need to bring to an end as fast as possible by examining the alternative models and then my successors choosing which one we should go for. for. And then we need to bear in mind the long-term damage to the British economy is based on how good our trading relationship will be with the European Union. Now, for my part, I think we want the closest possible relationship in terms of trading with the European Union, and that's something that can be discussed and debated in this House as well as by the next government.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, sadly, there has been more evidence that racist incidents are increasing. Evidence collated by monitoring groups shows that in the last 3 or 4 days alone, attacks and abuse from Stoke to Stockton, from Dorset to the Clyde. Can I ask the Prime Minister what monitoring systems he and the Home Secretary have put in place, what reports he's received from the police, and what extra resources are going to communities that have been targeted in these vile racist attacks that are taking place?
Well, first, let me agree with the right honourable gentleman. These attacks are appalling and they need to stop, and it's right that everyone in this House and everyone on all sides of the referendum debate utterly condemns them. That is not what we do in Britain. Let me say that I reassured Prime Ministers countries such as Romania and Poland and the Czech Republic who were concerned about this issue at the meeting that we had last night. So we do monitor these attacks and the Home Secretary gets regular reports, but I can tell the House that we will be publishing a new action plan on tackling hate crime shortly to step up our response. We want new steps to boost reporting of hate crime and supporting victims, new CPS guidance to prosecutors on racially aggravated crime, a new fund for protective security measures at potentially vulnerable institutions, and additional funding to community organisations so they can tackle hate crime. Whatever we can do, we will do to drive these appalling hate crimes out of our country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I thank the Prime Minister for that answer. Last Thursday, Mr. Speaker, was a rejection of the status quo, a status quo that clearly isn't delivering. There are now 13.5 million people living in poverty in Britain, up 300,000 in the last year. 4.5 million people in England and Wales alone are in insecure work, and 2/3 of children in poverty are living in households where at least one adult is in work. The Prime Minister has 2 months left. Will he leave a one-nation legacy? And will that one nation legacy be the scrapping of the bedroom tax, the banning of 0 hours contracts, and cancelling of the cuts to universal credit?
Where I would agree with the right honourable gentleman is, of course, we need to do more to tackle poverty, we need to do more to spread wealth and opportunity. But to try and pretend that last Thursday's vote was a result of the state of the British economy is complete nonsense. The British economy is incomparably stronger than it was 6 years ago. We all have to reflect on our role in the referendum campaign. I know the honourable gentleman says he put his back into it. All I'd say is I'd hate to see him when he's not trying.
Mr. Speaker, government figures released yesterday show the number of children living in poverty has jumped by 200,000 in a year, to a total now, a disgraceful total, of 3.9 million children in this country living in poverty. Does he not think he should at the very least apologise to them and the parents that have been failed by his government, and do something about it so that we do reduce the levels of child poverty in this country?
Well, if he wants to deal with the figures, let me give them to him. Income and inequality has gone down. Average incomes have grown at their fastest rate since 2001. He asks about poverty. There are 300,000 fewer people in relative poverty since 2010. 500,000 fewer people in absolute poverty since 2010. Look, if he's looking for excuses about why the side he and I were on about the referendum, frankly, he should look somewhere else. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about job insecurity and my 2 months to go. It might be in my party's interest for him to sit there. It's not in the national interest. And I would say, for heaven's sake, man, go.
Mr. Quinn. Jeremy Quinn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While media attention seems to be focused elsewhere, all of us in this House have constituents who have problems that need to be addressed. For weeks and weeks, my constituents have been struggling with the impact of unofficial industrial action on our railways. Not over jobs, not over wages, but over who gets to press a button. Will my right honourable friend condemn this in the strongest possible terms and help to resolve those issues?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Our transport infrastructure is a crucial part of our economy. I condemn any industrial action that disrupts the travelling public, and rail passengers will not thank the RMT and ASLEF for their recent unnecessary disruption. Frankly, the performance of Southern has been unacceptable and passengers deserve better. I can tell the House will be providing more generous compensation to passengers affected by the latest strike, and the Transport Secretary will be announcing further details soon.
Angus Robertson.
On the terrorist tragedy in Turkey, we on these benches join with the Prime Minister and the leader of the official opposition in our condemnation and sending our condolences to the people of Turkey. Mr. Speaker, a strong majority voted for Scotland to remain in the European Union. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is in Brussels today, where she's meeting with the President of the European Commission, where she is meeting with the President of the European Parliament. Yesterday there was a standing ovation in the European Parliament when the case was made to protect Scotland's place in Europe. What will the UK government do to protect Scotland's place in Europe?
Well, first of all, let me thank the right honourable gentleman for what he says about the terrorist attacks and how we should stand together against them. On the issue of the United Kingdom's future and our relationship with the European Union, we need to negotiate the best possible deal for the United Kingdom and the closest possible relationship, and that will also be the best possible deal for Scotland. That is what we need to focus on. That is what needs to be done.
Angus Robertson.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is wrong on that issue. And yesterday, the Scottish Parliament passed a motion across the Parliament, including the Labour Party, the Scottish Liberal Democrats and the Greens, who all mandated the Scottish Government to have discussions with the UK Government, other devolved administrations, the EU institutions and Member States to explore options for protecting Scotland's relationship with the EU, Scotland's place in the single market and the social employment and economic benefits that come from that. Every party in the Scottish Parliament voted for that, except the Conservative Party, who abstained. When will the Conservatives finally join with all other parties in Scotland in protecting Scotland's place in Europe?
The best way to secure Scotland's place in the single market is for the United Kingdom to negotiate the closest possible relationship with the European Union, including, in my view, the closest relationship with the single market. Our membership of the European Union is a UK membership, and that is where we should take our negotiating stance.
Jake Berry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Market traders in Rosendale and Darwin make a huge contribution to our local economy. With that in mind, would my right honourable friend call with me and literally thousands of Darreners to stop Blackburn Council going ahead with its plan to bulldoze Darwin's three-day market?
Well, let me join him in paying tribute to all the hard-working market traders across the country who provide us with excellent goods, often locally produced and sourced. I know how important these markets are. I certainly hope the local council will listen carefully to my honourable friend's campaign and make sure this historic market is not lost from Darwin altogether.
Justin Madders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister will recall visiting the Vauxhall car plant in my constituency as part of the referendum campaign. Now we have voted to leave the EU, we face a real fight to keep those jobs in this country, and so I will be urging General Motors to recognise their responsibility to build vehicles where many are bought. But I would ask the Prime Minister if he can ensure that there are early talks with General Motors and the wider motor industry so they are given the reassurance needed that motor vehicles will still be able to be exported to the EU at a competitive price.
No, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right. The story of the automotive industry in Britain over the last decade has been a remarkably positive one. There are 150,000 people directly employed. There are another 300,000 people in the supply and components industry, more of which has been coming on shore in recent years. I remember my visit very well. What we need to do is to secure the best possible deal for Britain, to make sure that we have that full access to the single market, because so many companies, General Motors included, and Nissan and Toyota and Jaguar Land Land Rover. One of the reasons they've invested in Britain is because of access to that market. And I would urge General Motors and others to make their voices heard, and we'll certainly be listening to them in the weeks ahead.
Bill Donnellan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, a former member of my staff was verbally abused and attacked whilst out shopping in London because of the colour of his skin, as of Pakistani origin. He was chased down the road by a lady shouting about how he had voted out and that people like him shoot others and blow up people.
Shame. Shame.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask the Prime Minister to reiterate the commitment that he's already given this morning to do everything in his power to eradicate this evil hatred, and reiterate that leaving the EU should not be used to breed racism, but in fact the opposite, and provide us with an opportunity now to be much more international rather than just European?
Well, this country, we have many imperfections, but we do have a claim to be one of the most successful multi-race, multi-faith, multi-ethnic democracies anywhere on earth, and we should do everything we can to safeguard that. What that means is the clearest possible statements from all our political leaders, which you've heard today and should go on hearing. But more to the point, we want action by the police, by the prosecuting authorities. The laws are there for these people to be prosecuted. They should be used. We're going to strengthen the guidance in the way that I suggested, but we should absolutely not put up with this in our country.
Alex Salmond.
Turning now to the Chilcot report. Is the Prime Minister satisfied with the arrangements announced for prior access for service families who died of soldiers who died in Iraq, given that Mr Blair has had months to prepare his PR defences, given that he has seen the relevant passages? And what are the parliamentary arrangements for secure prior access so this House can properly examine the findings and express any relevant views concerning the future suitable accommodation for Mr Blair?
What I'd say to the right honourable gentleman is first of all, in terms of members with service personnel families, we have made sure that they're not going to face the costs that they originally were in terms of accessing the report. I will check the details for the time they get to access the report and perhaps write to him. The parliamentary processes, again, I can put in a letter to him, so we're absolutely clear about what time the statement will be, how much time people will have to, including the Leader of the Opposition, to study the report in advance, and of course other right honourable gentlemen. I remember how important this was when I was Leader of the Opposition, having some access. As for those people who could be criticised in the report, he will know that there is a process where letters have to go out so people have a chance to respond to what's in the report. That is entirely independent of the government. Ministers haven't seen that. I haven't seen any of that. That has been dealt with by the Chilcot report under long-standing conventions. But again, I shall put that in my letter to the right honourable gentleman.
Sir Alan Duncan.
Moving to more cheerful matters, Mr Speaker, would my right honourable friend educate the House from his experience as Prime Minister on how, in terms of their country's reputation and success, he would compare the undemonstrative competence and dignity of Angela Merkel with the theatrical and comical antics of Silvio Berlusconi?
Fortunately, for my answer, neither of the people that he's talking about are candidates in this election, an election that I will stay firmly out of. I was given lots of advice on becoming Prime Minister. One of them was not to go to a party with Silvio Berlusconi, and that's one bit of advice I took and stuck to.
Mr Douglas Carswell.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving us last week's great exercise in democracy.
Order. The honourable gentleman will be heard, and it's about us and this place that he will be heard. Mr Douglas Carswell.
The Prime Minister for giving us last week's great exercise in democracy. We on the Leave side should recognise that although we won, it was a narrow mandate with plenty of decent, patriotic people voting for Remain. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that both sides now need to come together to achieve a new post-EU national consensus, whereby we have close links with our friends and allies in Europe and beyond, while reclaiming our sovereignty?
Well, first of all, let me thank the Let me thank the honourable gentleman for making the point that there were people who have a deep sense of patriotism on both sides of the argument. I also agree with him. It's time for people and our country to come together. And what's why I think he is right, that we now have to work very hard on what the alternatives are, because of course these were discussed and debated in the referendum campaign, but they were hypothetical alternatives. They are now real alternatives, and I think one of the roles the government can play in the next few months is to set out these different blueprints, the Canada blueprint, the Swiss blueprint, the Norway blueprint, and any other blueprints, and look at the costs and look at the benefits, so people can make a reasoned assessment now that this is a real choice rather than a hypothetical one.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, I know that all of Kent's members of Parliament would wish to be associated with the tribute paid by my right honourable friend to the memory of Paddy Mayhew. He was a scholar, he was a gentleman, and he was a great friend to his younger colleagues. Mr. Speaker, there are hundreds and thousands of expat United Kingdom citizens living around Europe who did not vote in the referendum. Many of them are elderly and frail. They live on UK pensions and UK benefits. Will my right honourable friend seek to ensure that his successor defends their interests?
Well, first of all, let me add to what he said on Sir Patrick Mayhew. He was a wonderful man and a great public servant, and I know he meant a lot to my honourable friend and many others. On this issue of British citizens living overseas, I think we should reassure people that until Britain leaves the EU, there's absolutely no change in their status. One of the things that this unit at the heart of Whitehall can do in the coming weeks is to go through these issues very methodically and work out what might need to change in all the different scenarios to give these people certainty about their futures. And it's obviously very important that we do that.
Gapes.
Mr. Speaker, London is the greatest city in Europe and in the world.
Order. I've enjoyed listening to the honourable gentleman for 25 years and I want to continue to hear him. Let's hear Mr. Gapes.
Its prosperity and tax revenue is vital for the whole United Kingdom. London voted Remain. Does the Prime Minister agree with the Mayor of London, a Labour winner, Sadiq Khan, that London now needs to remain in the European single market and needs devolved additional powers to deal with the problems caused by the vote last week?
Well, I certainly agree with the Mayor of London. Not only that London is the greatest city on earth, but London needs to make its voice heard in these vital negotiations. Obviously, there are many vital industries in London, but financial services is actually it's the capital not only of the UK's financial services, but Europe's financial services, and securing the best possible access to the single market is going to be a very important challenge in these negotiations. So London should have its voice heard. This is a UK negotiation, but we should listen to the nations of the United Kingdom, but also the cities and the regions as well.
Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to pay tribute to my right honourable friend, to his premiership and to the many achievements of his government, of which we can be proud. And may I also commend his condemnation of the vile racist attacks that have been reported from all over the country. And would he take this opportunity also to condemn the ridiculous and revolting behaviour of a certain MEP in the European Parliament yesterday, and make clear that he does not represent this country, and he does not represent, and he does.
I'll have people adding their own take on these matters. The honourable gentleman order. The honourable gentleman has the floor. Order. I don't need any help from the Scottish National Party benches. I'm perfectly capable of discharging my responsibility. The honourable gentleman will be heard, and that's all there is to it. Mr. Bernard Jenkins.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. He does not represent this country, and he does not even represent the vast majority of patriotic and law-abiding people who voted leave in the referendum.
Well, first of all, let me thank my honourable friend for his kind remarks and congratulate him for the role that he played in the campaign. Look, as for what MEPs have said and others, people should judge them by the remarks they make. I've made clear what I felt about Nigel Farage and that appalling poster in the campaign. I think the motive was absolutely clear and everyone can see what he was trying to do.
Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency of Torvine has received substantial amounts of EU funding. The Leave campaign in the referendum promised that funding would continue even if we left the European Union. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that if my constituency loses a penny piece of its funding under his successor, that will be a gross betrayal?
Well, it is the case that Wales as a whole is a net beneficiary of EU funds. And as I said throughout the campaign, if the vote was a no vote, I would want to do everything I could to make sure that we continue to help disadvantaged regions, we continue to help our farmers. Obviously, it's very difficult for anyone to give guarantees because you don't know exactly what will happen to our economy in the event of a leave vote, and our economy does face challenges. But it will be a matter for my successor as we leave the EU to make good on what they said at the time.
Maggie through.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that residents from across Erewash have chosen the Rocking Horse Nursery entry as the winning card for my designer birthday card for the Queen competition. Will the Prime Minister congratulate the 207 children who entered the competition?
Order! I want to hear about these pupils. Order! Order! I want to hear about these pupils who rightly should be congratulated. Let's hear the Honourable Lady.
Will the Prime Minister congratulate the 207 children who entered the competition with their amazing designs? And would he agree to present the cards to Her Majesty at his next audience?
There are many ways in which members of Parliament are able to interact at a more human level with our constituents, and getting them to do birthday cards and Christmas cards is an excellent idea. I once got it slightly wrong. Having Bryce Norton in my constituency, someone did a Christmas card with Santa letting presents out of the back of a C-17, which I thought was excellent, but some of my constituents felt that Santa was carpet bombing rather than handing out largesse. So with that proviso, it sounds a very good idea, and I'm sure Her Majesty will be delighted to receive them.
Oh, Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sheffield City region was set to receive £180 million in European structural funds through to 2020. Much of that money is now at risk. Those leading the Leave campaign did give guarantees that no area and no sector would lose out as a result of Brexit. Now we know that those promises were worthless, but will the Prime Minister join with me in urging his successor to ensure that Sheffield City region is compensated by the UK government for every pound of funding lost as a result of last Thursday's decision?
Obviously, as we negotiate our way out of the EU, a whole range of decisions are going to have to be made. And what a future government must do is make sure that we help our universities, we help sciences, we help disadvantaged parts of the country, we continue to support farmers. There is going to be a challenge, but we'll be able to judge for ourselves about whether we have more money to do this because we've left the EU, or less because of the impact on the economy. But that's something that we'll all be able to judge for ourselves in the years ahead.
To Henry Smith.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Unfortunately, earlier this morning, the Supreme Court ruled against a right of return of the Chagos Islanders to their homeland. I know that my right honourable friend will be pleased that shortly I won't pester him much more on this issue, but might I suggest that a very fine legacy of his premiership might be to allow these British citizens to return to their homeland.
Well, what I can say to my honourable friend is that the National Security Council has been considering this issue. We've looked at the alternative options. We've looked at the costs and the benefits of the various things that we could do, and we'll be making an announcement in the coming months.
Simon Danchuk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Grade 1 listed Rochdale Town Hall has been described as a rare, picturesque beauty. A bid to renovate this iconic building was rejected by the Heritage Lottery Fund in April. Of the 5 projects awarded grants, all 5 are based in the south of England. Would the Prime Minister consider supporting the renovation of this fantastic municipal building?
Well, the honourable gentleman is right. It is a beautiful building, and it is a historic town that he represents. In terms of the Heritage Lottery Fund, I think he's being a little unfair on focusing just on those last 5 projects. I think if he looks more broadly, he'll find, for instance, that the Blackpool Museum, I think, received a grant of over 13 million. So it is, I believe, fairly balanced across the country, but I will look further and perhaps write to him about the general point and the specific issue of his town hall.
James Berry.
Mr. Speaker, as well as Brits living abroad in the EU, there are a number of EU nationals living in this country, in my constituency, working hard, paying their taxes entirely legitimately. What reassurance can the Prime Minister give them that their position is secure? Because I know a number are very concerned.
Well, first of all, I think the first thing to do is to praise the contribution that they make to our country. There are 50,000 EU nationals working in our NHS. There are 60,000 working in our care sector, looking after our elderly as they come towards the end of their life. There are many working in education. As I said quite exhaustively on Monday, obviously we can say that all rights are guaranteed as we're members of the European Union. In the future, we will have to make sure, and I've heard members of the Leave campaign make this point, that people who are already here, people who are already studying, people who are working, must have their rights and their access guaranteed. But we can't say that now. We have to say that as part of the negotiation that will shortly take place.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, can I join with the tributes to you for all that you have done in your time of office? Does the Prime Minister agree that whatever the disagreements about the European Union, Prime Minister, you were in the Remain camp, I and my party were in the Leave campaign. The union that really matters is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and preserving that should be of the utmost importance. It works and it's staying together. Prime Minister, what has been done to make sure that happens in your remaining time in office?
Well, first of all, let me thank the honourable gentleman for his remarks, and let me agree with him that keeping the United Kingdom together is an absolute paramount national interest for our country. Because of the decision that's been made about Europe, we need to have exhaustive conversations between officials in Whitehall and in Northern Ireland, and very strong relations with the Republic of Ireland, so we keep the benefits of the common travel area. As for the honourable gentleman, he's always supported one blue team, Leicester City, and one day I hope he'll support another blue team, but there we are.
Mr. Kevin Olin-Rake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members of the single market for over 4 decades, many businesses have deeply embedded supply chains and customer relationships right across the EU. Does the Prime Minister agree that any future deal with the EU must include access to the single market?
I think my honourable friend is absolutely right, but obviously the term access to the single market has many potential different meanings. Obviously, countries outside the EU have access to the single market, some through a trade deal, some through World Trade Organization rules. Obviously, the best access is to be a member of the single market, and what the country is going to have to decide, and what the next Prime Minister will have to decide, is what sort of access that we want, what are the costs and benefits of having that access, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment when I give my statement on the European Council.
Finally, Neil Gray.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister will be aware that Terex Trucks in my constituency is consulting its staff and unions this week to shed a sixth of its workforce, and the company has approached the UK Government to receive support from the UK Export Finance, but from that £40 billion fund has only received a guarantee to the value of one of its trucks. Will he commit to meet with me to discuss this perilous situation for the company and its workforce, and what support his government can provide?
Well, first of all, I'm aware of the recent announcement about these further job losses, and this is obviously going to be a difficult time for the workers and their families. I understand both the Scottish and the UK Government have been working closely together with the company over the past couple of years as part of the Partnership Action for Continuing Employment scheme. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Scotland, is also keeping a close eye on the situation, and I'm happy to arrange a meeting between him and the honourable gentleman to talk about what more can be done.
Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on yesterday's European Council. This was the first Council since Britain decided to leave the European Union. The decision was accepted, and we began constructive discussions about how to ensure a strong relationship between Britain and the countries of the European Union. But before the discussion on Britain, there were a number of other items on the agenda, and let me touch on them briefly. On migration, the Council noted the very significant reductions in illegal crossings from Turkey to Greece as a result of the agreement made with Turkey in March, but it expressed continued concern over the central Mediterranean route and a determination to do all we can to combat people smuggling via Libya. Britain continues to play a leading role in Operation Sophia with HMS Enterprise, and I can tell the House today that Royal Fleet Auxiliary Mounts Bay will also be deployed to stop the flow of weapons to terrorists, particularly Daesh in Libya. On NATO, Secretary-General Stoltenberg gave a presentation ahead of the Warsaw Summit, and the Council agreed the need for NATO and the EU to work together in a complementary way to strengthen our security. On completing the single market, there are important commitments on the digital single market, including that EU residents will be able to travel with the digital content they purchased or subscribed to at home. On the economic situation, the President of the European Central Bank gave a presentation in the light of the outcome of our referendum. Private sector forecasts discussed at the Council included estimates of a reduction in Eurozone growth, potentially between 0.3% and 0.5% over the next 3 years. One of the main explanations for this is the predicted slowdown in the UK economy, given our trade with the euro area. President Draghi reassured the Council that the ECB has worked with the Bank of England for many months to prepare for uncertainty. And in the face of continued volatility, our institutions will continue to monitor markets and act as necessary. Mr. Speaker, returning to the main discussions around Britain leaving the EU, the tone of the meeting was one of sadness and regret. But there was an agreement that the decision of the British people should be respected. And we had positive discussions about the relationship we want to see between Britain and our European partners and the next steps on leaving the EU, including some of the issues that need to be worked through and the timing for triggering Article 50. Let me say a word about each. First, we were clear that while Britain is leaving the European Union, we are not turning our backs on Europe, and they are not turning their backs on us. Many of my counterparts talk warmly about the history and the values that our countries share and the huge contribution that Britain has made to peace and progress in Europe. For example, the Estonian Prime Minister described how the Royal Navy helped us secure the independence of his country a century ago. The Czech Prime Minister paid tribute to Britain as a home for Czechs fleeing persecution. Many of the countries of Eastern and Central Europe expressed the debt they feel to Britain for standing by them when they were suffering under communism and for supporting them as they joined the European Union. And President Hollande talked movingly about the visit that he and I will be making later this week to the battlefields of the Somme, where British and French soldiers fought and died together for the freedom of our continent and the defence of the democracy and the values that we share. So the Council was clear that as we take forward this agenda of Britain leaving the European Union, we should rightly want to have the closest possible relationship that we can in the future. In my view, this should include the strongest possible relationship in terms of trade, cooperation, and of course security, something that only becomes more important in the light of the appalling terrorist attack in Turkey last night. Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, as we work to implement the will of the British people, we also have a fundamental responsibility to bring our country together. We will not tolerate hate crime or any kinds of attacks against people in our country because of their ethnic origin. And I reassured European leaders who were concerned about what they had heard was happening in Britain. We are a proud, multi-faith, multi-ethnic society, and we will stay that way. Turning to the next steps on leaving the EU, first there was a lot of reassurance that until Britain leaves, we are a full member. That means we're entitled to all the benefits of membership and full participation until the point at which we leave. Second, we discussed some of the issues which will need to be worked through. I explained that in Britain there was great concern about the movement of people and the challenges of controlling immigration, as well as concerns about the issue of sovereignty. Indeed, I explained how these had come together. In turn, many of our European partners were clear that it is impossible to have all the benefits of membership without some of the costs of membership. And that is something that the next Prime Minister and their Cabinet is going to have to work through very carefully. Third, on the timing of Article 50, contrary to some expectations, there wasn't a great clamour for Britain to trigger this straight away. While there were one or two voices calling for this, the overwhelming view of my fellow leaders was that we need to take some time to get this right. Of course, everyone wants to see a clear blueprint in terms of what Britain thinks is right for its future relationship with the EU. And as I explained in my statement on Monday, we're starting this work straight away with a new unit in Whitehall, which will be led by a new Permanent Secretary, Oliver Robbins. This unit will examine all the options and possibilities in a neutral way, setting out the costs and benefits, so that the next Prime Minister and their Cabinet will have all the information they need with which to determine exactly the right approach to take and the right outcome to try and negotiate. But the decisions that follow from this, including the triggering of Article 50, are rightly for the next Prime Minister, and the Council clearly understood and, I believe, respected that. Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's a secret that I have at times found discussions in Brussels frustrating. But despite that, I do believe we can be proud of what we've achieved, whether it's putting a greater focus on jobs and growth, cutting the EU budget in real terms for the first time, reducing the burden of red tape on business, or building common positions on issues of national security, such as sanctions to stop Iran getting a nuclear weapon, standing up to Russian aggression in the Ukraine, and galvanising other European countries to help with the lead that Britain was taking in dealing with Ebola in Sierra Leone. In all these ways and more, we've shown how much more we have in common with our European partners as neighbours and allies and friends who share fundamental values, history and culture. It's a poignant reminder that while we will be leaving the European Union, we must continue to work together for the security and prosperity of our people for generations to come. And I commend this statement to the House.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of this statement. And as he took part in what I assume will be his last ever EU Council summit, I was very pleased he took a more conciliatory tone in relation to European neighbours than Nigel Farage did in the European Parliament yesterday. As we negotiate our exit from the European Union, the British people are relying on a government to facilitate as positive a transition as possible. And if we are to achieve this, we must proceed in a constructive and decent manner. I look forward to joining the Prime Minister, as I said at question time, at the commemoration of the Somme on Friday. He was right, too, to emphasise the role played by Britain in Europe in negotiating agreement with Iran and securing support for action to tackle the Ebola crisis in Sierra Leone. So I thank the Prime Minister for that. Yesterday, the Prime Minister said at the EU Council summit that in order to strike a new relationship between Britain and the European Union, European leaders would have to offer the UK more control over immigration. The threat of losing access to the single market means we're already seeing a negative effect on investment and business in this country. On Monday, the Prime Minister said access to the single market without accepting free movement was impossible. Does the Prime Minister now believe that Britain can negotiate an unprecedented deal? Can he also spell out a little more clearly than his statement what further discussions were held in this area? This is an issue in which there needs to be an open debate, dare I say an open and straight-talking debate, that absolutely failed to materialise during much of the referendum campaign. The Prime Minister stated in the House on Monday that Article 50 will not be triggered until his successor is in place. I heard what he just said about the views of other leaders at the summit. When does he expect Article 50 actually to be triggered so we'll know what the negotiating timetable is? As I raised in my response to the Prime Minister on Monday, we in the House have a duty to act in the national interest and ensure we get the best agreement for all of our constituents. Does the Prime Minister feel that without the structures in place for this House to debate the alternatives and lead a discussion in our communities, there is a risk of leaving Britain in a state of paralysis at a time when people need clear answers to their concerns? And would he also be able to tell us if there's been any further thought about the role of devolved governments in future negotiations with the European Union? We've seen today the First Minister of Scotland creating her own separate negotiating group and starting talks with the EU, and it appears the Minister of Gibraltar is doing the same also. What conversations has the Prime Minister had with the First Ministers in Scotland and Wales, and what legal advice he has received on separate negotiations by devolved administrations and indeed overseas territories? I welcome his commitment that HMS Enterprise will continue to play its part in Operation Sophia. Last week's vote to leave the EU means this country is currently in an unstable position. The next steps we take may be our most important and must be taken with care. We have a duty now to reshape and rebuild an economy for the future, one that protects social and employment rights and builds new policies on trade, migration, environmental protection and on investment, and deliver a country in which prosperity we create is shared by all. Therefore, I urge the Prime Minister, and whoever his successor may be, that what our economy needs now is a clear plan for investment, not further austerity and cuts to public services. That the Chancellor put forward yesterday. I also urge the Prime Minister and his successor one more time to look at the suspension and preferably the termination of his now even more counterproductive fiscal rule. I thank the Prime Minister for the assurances and condemnation he gave of racist attacks and abuse wherever they occur in this country, and I join him in that. We all need to calm our language and tone and across all parts of this House condemn the rise of racism within our society. Will he also reiterate absolutely his assurance to European Union nationals working here, providing support in our health service and so many other services, that they are welcome and that they remain welcome for the work and contribution they make? Mr. Speaker, our country is divided, so we must heal that division. Our economy is fragile, so we must begin to rebuild it. Our duty now is to move forward in a calm and conciliatory manner to build a new relationship with Europe and build a Britain that works for everyone in every part of this country.
Prime Minister.
Well, let me thank the right honourable gentleman for his response and the way he's gone about it. I think he's right that constructive is the correct word. I was pleased that the discussions last night did not get off to a tone of European Union countries demanding this set of actions, Britain's arguing for that set of actions. There was a mature and calm understanding that we need each other. We need this negotiation to proceed well. We need it to have a good outcome. It's in all our interests. So I think it has got off on the right foot, and I will do everything I can, whether in this job or in as a backbench MP, to make sure we keep those strong relationships with our European partners, because we're going to need to. On this issue of immigration versus the single market, he's right. This is, frankly, the biggest and most difficult issue to deal with. Frankly, whether you're in the European Union, as we have been arguing for changes, or whether you're out of the European Union trying to secure the best possible access to the single market. My answer to the problem was to bring in the welfare restrictions that I negotiated, which were incredibly tough to negotiate. I'm sad those now fall away because of the referendum decision. But there's no doubt the next government's going to have to work very hard at this. And I personally think that access to the single market and the strength of our economy is the single most important issue that they have to deal with. On the issue of Article 50, look, it is a matter for the next Prime Minister, and there's a very good reason for that, which is that before you go into the tunnel of the Article 50 negotiations, which have a 2-year time limit, you want to have made the best possible preparations for the precise blueprint you want to achieve at the end. That will help Britain, and frankly it will help the other European Union countries to understand what it is that we are shooting for. Now, they have said no negotiation without notification, but I don't think that excludes discussions that a new Prime Minister can have with partners or indeed with the institutions, so that we continue to get off on the right foot, and that is the strong advice that I would give to them. In terms of the devolved institutions, I've had conversations with the First Minister of Scotland, First Minister in Wales, Deputy and First Ministers in Northern Ireland. I'll continue to do so. I want them to be as involved as possible. I want their voices to be heard loud and clear. In terms of legal advice, the legal advice I've seen is that this is a UK decision made by the United Kingdom government and United Kingdom Parliament, and it has to be done in that way. On what he said about racism, I completely agree. We should all reiterate the statements that we've made. To EU nationals that are here, we should thank them for their contribution, say that their rights are guaranteed while we remain in the EU, and we'll be working hard, and I'm sure all contenders in the Conservative leadership campaign will want to make clear that, they want to safeguard the rights of people who work here and study here from the European Union for the future. But that will be a matter for them. Finally, what he says about suspending the fiscal rule, I have to say it does feel a little bit like a stuck record. Whatever the problem, whatever the issue, the answer always seems to be more borrowing, more spending, more taxing and more debt. And I have to say that isn't all, you don't get investment unless you have economic stability. And you don't have economic stability if you don't have a plan for dealing with your debts and your deficit. This has been proved the world over, including in some of his favourite countries like Venezuela. And I really would argue not to go down that route.
Sir William Cash.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend quite rightly has referred to trade and cooperation with the European Union, and of course we've always argued that from the Leave side. Would my right honourable friend give us some further advice, however, because he's talking about very precise blueprints and he's also talking about alternative models. Will he give us an absolute assurance that any such models or blueprints will be exclusively based on the assumption that we are repealing the European Community Act 1972?
Prime Minister.
Well, we are leaving the European Union, so surely that must be the case. But the reassurance I give him is, look, I'm not saying there are only 4 or 5 blueprints and Britain has to follow any one of those. Obviously, we can try and amend blueprints and have Norway Plus or Norway Minus or a better trade deal than Canada. But I think what is important for colleagues in the House to understand and the country to understand is there are some quite fundamental questions about whether you want full access to the single market, unrestricted access to the single market, and the price you might have to pay in return for that, or whether you're satisfied to have less than full access and therefore to have some other compensating advantages. We have to go through all of those, and the more we can attach facts and figures to them, I think the more people can make an informed choice.
Angus Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Prime Minister has returned from Brussels for the first time in 40 years, Member States from the rest of the EU are still there and they are discussing the future of Europe. And while the Prime Minister is not in Brussels, Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is in Brussels. And she's gone there to protect Scotland's interests in Europe and preserve our place in Europe. She's met with the President of the European Commission and the President of the European Parliament. She's also meeting with one of the key European negotiators on Brexit, the former Prime Minister of Belgium, Guy Verhofstadt. The First Minister has also spoken to Taoiseach Enda Kenny and will be meeting the diplomats from other EU member states. Nicola Sturgeon is doing this with a mandate from the Scottish Parliament, including the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish Green Party. An expert group has been established to advise on protecting our place in Europe, including eminent diplomats, economists and constitutional experts. These include a former British judge in the European Court of Justice, the former British ambassador to NATO, the former economic advisor to the European Commission, and the former permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and head of the UK Diplomatic Service. All of us need to work to explore ways to protect Scotland's relationship with the European Union, our place in the single market, and the social, employment and economic benefits that come from that. May I ask the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, whether the Prime Minister raised this at the Council of Ministers? Didn't he even raise Scotland at the Council of Ministers? Did he say that Scotland wants to stay in the European Union? Did he say that Gibraltar wants to stay in the European Union? Did he say that London wants to protect its important position in Europe? When are we going to get some leadership on this from the UK government? Or is he just going to stand by and watch England leave the European Union and England declare independence from the rest of the United Kingdom?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, yes, there is a meeting of the 27 other members of the European Union this morning, and that was always going to happen if we were going to make the decision to leave, because just as we must prepare our negotiating position, they will want to prepare theirs. But the good thing about last night's conversation is it got off on a very reasonable, fair and constructive basis. What I would say to the right honourable gentleman, I'm glad that the First Minister of Scotland is having these meetings. It's always useful to meet and talk with our European counterparts. But at the end of the day, the best way we can secure the best possible access for Scotland into the single market is for the United Kingdom to negotiate as hard as it can as one. Now, to answer his very specific questions about whether I talked about Scotland last night, yes, I did. I talked about this Parliament, I talked about Scotland, because the way we actually managed last night's meetings, we took a bit of a cue from what happens in this House, is I set out what I thought the result of the election, the referendum was, and why. I set out what I believe Britain's and the United Kingdom's aims would be. I explained how different parts of the United Kingdom voted, and then all 27 other members spoke. Many asked questions, and at the end of the dinner I answered all their questions, as I do in this House, Mr. Speaker, as fully as I could. So a little bit of British parliamentary practice was introduced into the European Council, and I think it's a good way of doing things.
Very good for the European Council as well, without a shadow of a doubt. Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And on that subject, did my right honourable friend reiterate to the EU Council that we do not have a federal structure in the United Kingdom. We did not vote in the referendum as England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland or even London, but as British citizens, each with an equal voice and equal weight, and that all future decisions must be taken by the United Kingdom government and no one else? And does he also accept that such was the importance of free movement of people in the referendum, that any future deal reached with our European partners that does include free movement would be regarded as a betrayal by millions of people who voted to leave?
I did emphasise that it's a UK decision, but also the United Kingdom will want to listen very carefully to all of the constituent nations and the views of their ministers and their parliaments in setting out the negotiation that we want to carry on. As for this issue of free movement of people, that will be for the next Prime Minister and Government and Parliament to decide. But I'm in no doubt that this is the difficult issue. Frankly, it's a difficult issue inside the EU, where you've got all the negotiating ability to try and change things, and I think it will be in many ways even more difficult from outside if you want full access to the single market to secure change. But nevertheless, that's the challenge. I explained very clearly to them that that was my reading of the referendum result. It was this coming together of concern about free movement of people and migration, combined with a sense of control and sovereignty over that, and that I was very sad at the result. I think the economic case for staying in was very strong, but if we want to make this relationship work, whether out or in, we have to listen to people and try and find a way through this.
Tim Farron.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and I wonder whether in his discussions yesterday he's aware of a growing mood among heads of government across the European Union, certainly the 7 Liberal Prime Ministers I spoke to yesterday, that given that 3/4 of the young people of Britain voted to remain in Europe, they should be permitted as far as possible to remain in Europe, and what can be done to make sure that young people are allowed access to Europe even over and above those of the rest of us. Is he also aware of the great concern amongst many communities who depend upon European funding, mostly, and most importantly, I would say, Britain's farmers, many of whom are deeply concerned at the loss of cap payments at some point in the next 2 years? So can he make a guarantee today that British farmers, particularly livestock and dairy farmers, will continue to have direct payments to keep them in business even after we leave the European Union, if we do?
First of all, on young people, I think he's right that people want to have those opportunities to work and to travel and to study. And one of the things this EU unit will need to do is to work out the precise nature of the agreements, like the Erasmus Agreement and others, and what access we can have to them from the outside of the European Union. On the issue of funding, the European budget is set out between 2014 and 2020, including the amount of money that goes to our farmers. What I can guarantee is while we're in, those payments continue, and obviously contracts will be honoured, but it will be for a future government to determine at the point of departure what payments we should continue to make to our farmers. If it was me making the decision, I'm keen to have a living, working countryside, but we'll have to go through those options, and a future Prime Minister will have to decide.
Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Does the Prime Minister agree with the unanimously taken view of the Foreign Affairs Committee that the construction of Article 50 means that it is perfectly likely that there will be no agreement on the other side of the negotiations requiring QMV from our partners and the agreement of the European Parliament at the end of the 2 years, and that would mean, though, that we would still have access to the single market, but we would be subject to World Trade Organization most favoured nation terms, and since that would mean there is then no free movement of people and we would not be paying into the budget in the way, that would represent a perfectly sound bottom line for the United Kingdom in the negotiations. And could the Prime Minister, and that it's likely, though, that other advances will be made on that before we arrive at a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement? And could the Prime Minister also say, just tell us about the fate of the British presidency next year? We will still be a full member. Are we going to take up our responsibilities?
The General's got to practice. We're going to be hearing from him very, very regularly, given the illustrious position that he holds. But he's got to be briefer than that, I'm afraid. Prime Minister.
I did look at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee report, and while I'm not fully liberated and able to say what I think, I thought that the conclusions were I was thinking of a place in London close to Dagenham, but I won't go there. No, if we leave the EU and we have no deal in place, the WTO tariffs are for things like 10% on cars, 12% on clothes, 36% on some dairy produce. This is not a good outcome for the United Kingdom. So, look, we'll look at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and I'll as we get this unit up and running, and look at all the alternatives. But I really think that is not a good outcome for the United Kingdom.
Well said. No decisions have been taken.
Mr. Nigel Dobbs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Prime Minister for his service to this country, for his support for Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Executive through very difficult times during his premiership, and also support for the United Kingdom, and wish him and his family very best wishes for the future. On the issue of the summit, can the Prime Minister spell out again, not least to reassure our European partners in Central and Eastern Europe, our commitment to NATO, and that our European partners who are now speaking somewhat ill of our decision last Thursday should be reminded that the UK is one of the main contributors to NATO, is a firm supporter of European defence and security, and that they should play a greater role in stepping up to contributing to European defence along with the Americans and ourselves. So in all of this, the wider perspective needs to be looked at. EU is important, single market, but NATO and defence and security of Europe, not least and particularly in regard to the aggression of Russia, needs to be borne in mind very, very strongly.
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me thank him for his kind remarks. He's right that our commitment to NATO continues, and it's a very important organisation we're a member of. I think he's also right that our spending, being 2% of our national output, is now responsible for a very large share of the overall European commitment, and we should be encouraging others to increase their spending. We need to make sure that our membership of NATO continues, and we're not disadvantaged by being in one and out of the other.
Caroline Spellman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend consistently made the case for British car workers. Indeed, he made his last appeal to the country from Birmingham, which was much appreciated. Would he agree that reciprocity between the UK and the EU is the absolute key to protecting the hundreds and thousands of jobs which depend on our access to that principal market?
I'm very grateful for what my right honourable friend says. Anyone who thinks that there isn't something of a manufacturing renaissance taking place in Britain should go to that plant, that Jaguar Land Rover plant. I think 7 or 8 years ago there were 4,000 people there. There are now 14,000 people there. And it's not just manufacture and assembly. It is design, it's R&D, it's technology. They're taking on literally hundreds of apprentices every year. It is a magnificent car plant, and it's something we want to see more of. And I think it's absolutely crucial for companies like that we keep the European market open, and we keep companies like that investing in our country rather than investing in countries inside the European Union, because that always is an alternative for them. And I think that draws into sharp relief the importance of maintaining a very strong access to the single market.
Yvette Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's obviously a difference between future free movement reform and the position of existing residents. The Prime Minister said earlier that we could not confirm residency or employment rights for EU citizens who live here already until the negotiations were underway. Well, why is that the case? Given that this is being exploited by awful go-home campaigns or repatriation campaigns. Surely we should take a firm stand against those and pass some swift motions or legislations or new immigration rules in this House before the summer recess to put an end to that speculation, provide reassurance to EU citizens who may have worked here for very many years. And I really urge him to consider this, because I think for the sake of community cohesion, this would be a wise thing to do.
Well, I'll obviously look very carefully at what the Right Honourable Lady says. I've tried to answer the question as accurately and factually and legally as I can, because, of course, as we go into this negotiation, if we come out of the negotiation, for instance, it'll be a future government, but arguing for visa requirements or restrictions on numbers or quotas or work permits or whatever for European nationals to come here, other countries might take reciprocal action against British citizens trying to go and travel and work and live in other countries. Now, I think even if that were to happen, I think the answer, I'm sure, would be to guarantee the status of anybody here now. And we can say that, while we're in the European Union, but I think it is for a future Prime Minister to make that decision.
Sir Eric Pickles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I readily understand that negotiations are going to be long and protracted on economic issues, but the last few years have seen a big improvement in terms of our cooperation, automatic cooperation, on matters of security, both those formal and informal meetings. I can't see that that should be much of a weighty negotiating piece there. Surely it makes sense to ensure that those formal and informal meetings continue, both in terms of dealing with terrorism, but also dealing with economic crime.
Minister. I think my right friend puts it very well. There are a number of informal mechanisms that have grown up, including the counter-terrorism group of countries, mostly European Union, and meeting at very high levels of our intelligence and security services. But there are also quite a lot of now growing mechanisms within the EU, such as the Schengen information systems, the watch lists there are for people travelling between European Union countries, some of which are bound up very much in EU institutions and rules. And people can like that or not like that, but the fact is they exist, and we're going to have to work out, and we can start this work now, of how to maintain access to as much of that as is possible in terms of our national security.
Kate Hoey.
Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister explain to the millions of people who voted to leave why in the next few months, while we await a new Prime Minister, this country, using Majesty's government, all the professionalism that they've got, start talking and negotiating informally, perhaps, with Canada, with Australia, with Malaysia, with all those other countries who would be desperately keen to sign up to a trade agreement. Why can we not do some of these things? And if the Prime Minister, if we are still paying our full amount into the European Union, are we still now going to be signed up to having to sign every single directive that comes through in the next 2 years?
First of all, on the Honourable Lady's points about Canada, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, of course we can start those conversations. I think it's difficult to start full-on trade negotiations because until you know the relationship between Britain and the European Union single market, I think it's quite difficult to get into an intensive discussion, but you can certainly have some pathfinding discussions. On the issue of directives, I think we have to be very clear. We're members of this organisation, we pay into this organisation, and that continues until the day we leave. And therefore, I think we have to obey the rules and laws, just as we'd expect other European Union countries not to suddenly not obey the rules with respect to us. I think that's important. I think in terms of decisions that need to be made right now, there are those that have to be made for legal and practical reasons. There may be some decisions that can be put off for a month or two in order to have a new government that can think of them in the context of the renegotiation. But I don't think we should do anything to break the law.
Mark Prisk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst we are naturally focused on our future role in Europe, our friends in the Baltic nations are concerned about their immediate risks across the border. These are both military and also things like cyberspace, as my right honourable friend knows very well. Is he therefore satisfied that all that can be done is being done, both within NATO but also within the European Union, to stand by our friends?
I think that my honourable friend makes a very good point. Yes, I think enough is being done. We've got the Warsaw Summit coming up, where we'll be, as part of that, playing quite a big role in making sure there are visible military presences in the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. We'll be playing our part, and the Americans will be playing theirs. And I think it's very important we keep up that reassurance, because for them this is the absolute key thing that Britain brings to help their security.
Al Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was at the passionate pro-EU demonstration last night outside the House of Lords.
Yeah, wasn't it marvellous?
I have to report that I did not see the Prime Minister there, nor the member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip. So I can tell him that the most popular chant they repeated over and over again was "Eton mess, Eton mess." Many of those people were students, they were young people, and that's because universities have benefited greatly from membership of the European Union. My own university in Bangor reckons £100 million came our way over 7 years. So what can the Prime Minister and his government and the future governments do to make sure that that funding or similar funding is secured?
Well, obviously, I wasn't there because I was in Brussels at the time, and well, I'm all for having your cake and eating it. I haven't worked out how to be in two places at the same time. Look, I think I've said what I can say about funding for universities. It's important we continue to get it through the European Union under the Horizon programme while we're a member, and afterwards decisions will have to be made, but we must support our universities. But I think, he and I have to be frank with each other that Wales actually didn't vote to remain in the European Union, in spite of the fact that actually Wales is a net beneficiary. Welsh farming does well out of Europe. I think the Welsh steel industry will do far better if we're in rather than out, and all these other arguments. So we've all got to look. I take my share of responsibility that we didn't win this campaign, but we've all got to think about how we can, even now we're leaving, make better arguments about how Britain can remain as engaged as possible.
Mr. David Nuttall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister, not just for his statement today, but for all his work that he's done over the past 6 years to protect UK interests when he's been attending these European Union Council meetings. But with respect to the meeting yesterday, did my right honourable friend detect any regret on the part of other EU leaders that they did not make more concessions when he sought to renegotiate our terms of membership?
Prime Minister.
It's a very good question, and one I'm quite keen to answer, because the sense in the European Council was that they had really bent over backwards to give a country that already had a special status out of the euro, out of the Schengen system, things that they found profoundly uncomfortable. Many of those countries really do believe in ever closer political union, however wrong we might think it is here in this country, and they hated saying to Britain, right, you're out of this. That really pained them, but they did it. They particularly disliked having to agree to cut welfare benefits for their own citizens, because that is actually what they signed up to do. And so I believe, and will always believe, it was a good negotiation. It didn't solve all of Britain's problems, and I never said it did, but it certainly addressed some of the biggest concerns that British people had. And I would say that I always want to know whether there's more that could have been done, but the very strong sense I get is this issue of full access to the single market and reform of free movement is very, very difficult. We achieved some reforms of free movement, but I think the idea there is an enormous change to free movement, particularly perhaps from outside the EU, I think is a very, very tough call, and people have to think that through very carefully before we get into the negotiations.
Ben Bradshaw.
The referendum was about our membership of the European Union and not about our membership of the single market. And given the very grave damage that is already being done to our economy because of the uncertainty, would he call on all of those in this House who aspire to lead this country to commit themselves to keeping Britain in the single market with full access?
Well, I think the right honourable gentleman makes an important point. I think this is one of the key arguments. When I examine why I've always believed we're better off in, even though I've wanted to see reform, to me it's always come down to this: the single market exists, we're in it, it will go on existing even if we leave it, and it has a profound effect on our economic and business and political and national life. So I would certainly urge my colleagues to want to aim for the greatest possible access. But obviously they're going to have to think about what the benefits and disbenefits of that route are.
Mr. John Barron.
Does the Prime Minister accept that when negotiating with the EU we should remember our many strengths? One of the strongest economies, our many competitive advantages which would more than compensate for any tariffs which the WTO will ensure cannot be punitive even if they were imposed, whilst nations around the world are already, including Australia, including New Zealand, are already knocking at our door with regards to trade deals.
Well, certainly no one is more impressed by the strength of the British economy than me. I think it is strong. It's got many advantages, many key industries that are admired the world over. We have to recognise it's going to be a hard and difficult negotiation in many ways, because we're negotiating with a bloc of 440 million people. But no, certainly we should make the most of our strengths. I would, though, avoid tariffs. I really think this idea that tariffs can be compensated for in other ways is quite dangerous talk. If you think of the car companies and others that want to come and invest here, they don't want to come and invest here and then pay tariffs as they sell into the European single market. So I think they are, on the whole, to be avoided.
Mr. David Winnick.
The campaign undoubtedly made totally false pledges, and they've all been exposed accordingly. But coming back to the issue which has been raised on a number of occasions today, does not some of the responsibility for the result lie with the EU leadership, the way in which they showed no flexibility whatsoever over an issue, certainly in my part, which I have the honour to represent, the issue of the free movement of labour? You know, EU law didn't come down with the Ten Commandments.
For once, I have some great sympathy with the honourable gentleman. That is why I chose to aim at this issue by saying that people could come here and work, but they couldn't get full access to our welfare system for 4 years. And I think that did address the concern that his constituents have and my constituents have about there shouldn't be something for nothing. I think the point we have to understand is that European Union countries see the single market as consisting not only of the free movement of goods, people, services and capital. They see those things bound together, but they also see the single market include the payments that countries make into the EU to strengthen the weakest members and those that have recently recovered from communism. And of course one can try and negotiate amendments to these movements, and I did, but one has to think about that mindset as we go into the negotiation.
Sir Oliver Heald.
The Prime Minister will be aware that North Hertfordshire voted to stay in the EU. Many of our businesses rely on the single market, and many of my constituents work in London in insurance, financial services and legal work. Does he agree with me that part of this negotiation must be about the passporting arrangements which enable these service interests to do so well? And I don't know if it was mentioned at the European Council, but can I also thank him for everything he's done?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend for his remarks. I think this issue of passporting is going to loom very large in these negotiations for the reason that financial services are 7% of our economy, 2/3 of the jobs are outside London. We are the financial centre for Europe, 40% of financial services are in Europe. And we will be strong in that area, whatever the outcome. But it's undoubtedly true that the passport does help British firms, and it helps other countries' firms come to Britain. One of the reasons the Swiss banks are here in such large measure is they don't get passporting rights as Switzerland. And so I think this should be a very important feature. It's one of the issues about what access to the single market actually means.
Dr. Alistair MacDonald.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And could I thank the Prime Minister for all his efforts. Does he agree with me, though, that does he fully recognise the very difficult position that Northern Ireland is now in? We voted to stay. We want to stay. Yet we are hostage to the mistakes of others who were misled by false promises. Unlimited funding for the NHS and lorry loads of money for farmers. Does he recognise that Northern Ireland will need to open up opportunities to protect their interests and maintain a closer relationship with Europe? And particularly, has he had time to give any thought to how the settlement of 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, is undermined by the dismantling of much of the legislation that hinges on the EU?
Prime Minister.
Well, obviously we will look at the specific questions he raises very closely. That's something that officials in Northern Ireland and officials in Westminster can start with straight away. But I want us to keep all the benefits that we've had from the common travel area, and I think what we'll have is the closest possible cooperation with the government of the Republic of Ireland. The Taoiseach last night made a very moving speech about how Britain and Ireland, we've been fighting each other. I think he said since 1169. I haven't checked up my dates, but you're nodding, so I think I've got that right. He then went through some of the key elements of the conflict, in which I'm sure probably relatives of mine were probably involved, but who knows? But pointed out, and I'm very proud, he says today relations between the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland have never been stronger, and we must not let that go.
Chris White.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituency is home to a number of significant manufacturing and technology businesses. These businesses play a major role in our local economy. What reassurance can the Prime Minister give me that this trade will continue to grow, not least with Warwick's very strong vote to remain?
Well, I think this comes back to the issue of, thank my honourable friend for his remarks, this comes back to the issue of manufacturing and access to the single market. I think this needs to loom very large in the negotiation. Obviously, nothing changes for the next probably 2 years at least while this negotiation carries on. But we need to make sure as we come out of the end of that Article 50 process that we have this access properly set out so our manufacturers know what they're doing.
Vaz.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his strong condemnation of the racist attacks on members of the Polish community and others? And can I pay tribute to him for the respect and commitment that he has shown to Britain's ethnic minority community over the last 6 years, and indeed for creating the most diverse administration of any Conservative Prime Minister in history? In respect of the summit yesterday, was there a discussion of the comments made by the Mayor of Calais or the French Economy Minister that the juxtaposed borders be taken out of France and returned to the United Kingdom? Does he agree with me that this is a deal that was made between Britain and France and has got absolutely nothing to do with the referendum?
Prime Minister.
Well, first of all, let me thank him for his comments about my support for Britain's ethnic minorities and the diversity we see on these benches. That has been a very important change in our politics and one I hope to see continue. We didn't discuss last night the juxtaposed border control issue, nor the remarks of the Mayor of Calais. My view is this is a treaty between Britain and France. We certainly want to keep it. We hope the French do too. But I don't resolve from anything I said in the referendum campaign about the risks there are. So we need to redouble our efforts to try to make sure that the borders remain where they are.
Andrew Turner.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that 100,000 migrants is about the maximum number of people that they are willing to accept at the moment, especially outside London and the home counties?
Prime Minister.
I wouldn't put it like that. The point I've always made is that I think we should have a sense of what the net migration should be. In a modern, advanced world and a modern, advanced country like Britain, you have, often well over 100,000